Welcome to your next episode. I'm Amy.
And I'm Louise.
Today's guest is Dr Sohom Das. Sohom is a consultant forensic psychiatrist working in prisons and criminal courts, assessing and rehabilitating mentally ill offenders, and he's also an author. Hello, Sohom. How are you?
Morning. Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Can you just explain what a forensic psychiatrist actually is?
Sure. So a psychiatrist is somebody who's a doctor first. So we go through medical school, and then after a couple of years of doing general medicine, you can specialise in psychiatry, which is obviously the assessment and treatment of mental illness. And within psychiatry, there's lots of subspecialties. So there's child and adolescent, old age, for example, and then there's forensics. So that's the crossover between the law and psychiatry. So I see people who have committed very serious offences, usually violent offences or sexual offences, who have serious mental illnesses. And as you said before, I've worked in prisons. Currently, I work in courts. And also the third environment for a forensic psychiatrist is locked, secure units for high-risk patients.
Initially, Sohom was going to talk to us about psychiatry and mental health in more general terms, but given the conversations going on and the events going on all around us about ingrained systemic racism in British society, we've decided to focus on asking questions about this in relation to the criminal justice system and the mental health systems, both of which are areas, obviously, Sohom has experience of as a forensic psychiatrist.
So the fact is that research studies and monitoring have consistently shown that of all the black and minority ethnic groups in Britain, those from black communities in particular are disproportionately represented in both the criminal justice system and the mental health system, and those two are linked, and we'll move on to that in a bit. And that's compounded by the fact that both of those systems really seriously disadvantage black people once they are within their remit. So I know this is a midlife podcast, but I'm seeing a lot of midlife posts on social media. I'm hearing it from midlife people that I know. This like a real sort of denying of the fact that black people are disadvantaged within the criminal justice system and mental health system. So, firstly, black Britons make up 12% of prison population, but that's even though their proportion in the general population is 3%. Is that correct?
That's correct. And just to add to that, what I think is even more alarming is that when you look at the population that are detained who are under 18, it's actually much higher. It's almost 50% of people that are detained in secure units and youth offenders institutes are from minority ethnic groups.
Right. And if we go back to get a picture of how that comes to be, we can see that black communities are overrepresented at, as I said earlier, every single stage of the criminal justice process, from initial contact right through to sentencing. So black people are more likely to get stopped and searched, more likely to get arrested, more likely to get charged, and more likely to get convicted than their white contemporaries. So, Sohom, why is that? What is the precise nature of the discrimination in the criminal justice system?
That's a very good question, and it's also a very complicated issue. I think to answer that, you have to really get into the roots of the inequality. So that starts with the fact that there's a lot of socioeconomic factors that are stacked against minorities. So we're talking about poverty, inequalities in earnings, lack of educational opportunities and job opportunities. So, for example, black applicants have to submit several more job applications, even with the same qualifications as their white counterparts, to get an interview. So I think all of these things contribute to why crime is prevalent in certain communities.
Right.
And also, I think violence breeds violence. So black on black knife crime in South London is one very good example of this. I think part of the reason, you said yourself, Louise, that it happens in every aspect of the system. So from arrest to trial and conviction, I think a lot of that is to do with the lack of diversity within the judiciary itself.
Right.
So to give you an example, I work in 2 criminal courts in central London, and I work with around 25 to 30 judges, and only one of them is from a BAME origin. And I think the root of the problem is that young black men And increasingly, I think, for young Muslim men, are identified as being different or assumed to be dangerous.
You see, I did read that somewhere that, all criminal justice officials, so police officers, magistrates, often view, I can't remember the figures, but they view black men as dangerous and a risk. Do you think it's just institutional racism existing at every level?
I think it is. And I would like to think that it's not coming from a place of hatred and it's not intentional, it's not overt. I'd like to think that it's a subconscious bias, but I don't think you could really know unless you get into the mind of the perpetrators. And when I say perpetrators, I mean the judges who give out sentences, the doctors like forensic psychiatrists who detain using the Mental Health Act, nurses who restrain and medicate patients when they're in wards, and also the way that police officers treat black prisoners. So there's a much more likelihood that they will have adjudication, and placed in segregation, like in solitary confinement.
But the system, presumably the criminal justice system I'm talking about now, it doesn't acknowledge institutional racism? Is it something that's brought up and it's just like, oh no, that's not happening? Or
I think it's acknowledged. I think that the research shows a clear bias. So when you look at the actual proportion of black males that end up in prison, and also the proportion of black males that are detained under the Mental Health Act, that's not only disproportionate to the population, but it's also disproportionate to the number of people that we know have mental illnesses. So to put that into context, we know that black men and white men roughly have the same incidence of mental illness, even though black men are far more prone to psychosis. So I think the evidence is there and it's acknowledged, but to actually, change a culture of thinking is very difficult. And I don't know if there are clear, easy solutions to that, to be honest.
I've seen so much online about changing the curriculum. So if we thread this all the way back to education, do you think that could be a cog in the wheel that changes, that then leads out to better change?
Yes and no. So working in the NHS and working in mental health, we have these modules, these compulsory modules to do with diversity. And I think there's an argument that if somebody's inherently racist, then sitting them down in a classroom and going through simulations is not going to change their core beliefs. But if you take it back even further and you think about the history that you're teaching children, then I think that's a very valid point. So to talk about my own experiences, I remember from my history lessons at school, we learned about all Henry VIII's numerous wives, and we learned about the Tudors and the Windsors. And from my personal schooling experience, we didn't have one single lesson that talked about the British Empire, that talked about, for example, the partition of India and Pakistan, which caused the death of millions, and civil war that's going on to this day. And I think you could argue that that is more important because it had more of an impact on the whole world than Henry VIII and her wives. And I think it should be done in a balanced and fair way. Like obviously the British Empire did do a lot of good and brought benefit to a lot of countries. But I guess my point is that if you don't know how it all started and where it all came from, then you're not really in a position to make an informed decision about how you judge a race.
Absolutely. I guess it's about attracting more people of colour into the teaching profession, rather than, a white 52-year-old man standing there, a history teacher teaching children. It can be you are having a better representation.
Yep, from teachers to police to judges. I think it just needs to be proportionate. It needs to be fair. I don't think you should swing too much the other way. It doesn't need to be an over-representation, but then it just needs to be a proportionate representation. And especially at the higher echelons, I think that's where the problem is. It's when you're talking about ministers and policymakers. There needs to be a diverse selection.
So we've spoke a little bit about the mental health system. Obviously the overwhelming evidence is that black patients' experiences are more negative than those of white patients. Could you describe sort of in what way, or if they receive different medical treatment? Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with a little story that I think is very relevant to this.
Please.
So there's a man called David Bennett, known as Rocky Bennett, who in 1998, he was in a medium secure unit, which is exactly the kind of place that I've worked in Norwich. And he was the only BAME person on his ward. and he had an altercation with another patient who had racially abused him. And the evidence suggests that Rocky was punished for this. He was removed from the ward, and he was about to be taken to be secluded, and he became upset and he assaulted a nurse. And then 5 nurses tried to restrain him, and he was restrained face down for about 25 minutes, and that's how long it took for them to actually realise that he died halfway through this process. And it was just handled really badly by the unit. So they didn't inform his family of the death until the following morning, and then they tried to suggest that it was from breathing difficulties. And the CPS decided not to prosecute anybody for his death. So the actual trial was in 2000. And of the 5 nurses, almost all of them have returned to work. And the formal inquiry found that there was systemic racism. And for me, that's very reflective of the Black Lives Matter movement and the reasons that it all started in America. And the reason I brought this up was because it was one of the cases that we were taught about when I was a registrar, and it actually changed some of the system. So after this all happened, after the inquiry, they made rules and protocols about how patients should be restrained. So, for example, they're not allowed to be restrained in a prone position for longer than 3 minutes. And there's also like a national system of training and control and restraint. Right. But to answer your question into how it happens, or what it looks like, Black people and people from minority ethnic groups are much less likely to be offered less restrictive support, so less likely to be offered psychology, talking therapies, more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. I think Black people are 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to be detained. They're more likely to be brought in by the police. They're more likely to be restrained and medicated once they're in hospital. And there's community treatment orders. I'm not sure if you've heard about these, but these are contracts that are made when patients are discharged from psychiatric units, and they have certain conditions. For example, taking medication, seeing your psychiatrist on a regular basis, staying away from alcohol and drugs. And if you break one of those conditions, then it's like a fast route to be readmitted. So you kind of bypass the Mental Health Act and go straight into hospital. The reason I bring these up is because Black people are 8 times more likely than their white counterparts to be placed on a CTO overall.
And are there enough of people like you to assess and treat, or are you really rushed off your feet and unable to spend as much time as you would like to supporting, treating, caring for people?
Yeah, I would say that there has gradually been a big strain on the whole environment. So even within the time that I've worked within forensic psychiatry, so I've worked specifically with offenders since 2011. And I can literally see over time that the service is just getting more and more stretched and overloaded. So there are not enough forensic psychiatrists in prison. There are more people with severe mental illness in prison. There's less spaces within forensic psychiatric units, and the waiting lists are sometimes horrific. Like it's not unknown for us to assess a patient who's floridly psychotic, who's refusing medication in prison. We refer them to the unit, and for no fault. It's not a fault in the unit itself, but their waiting list is so long because the turnover of patients is so low that sometimes we keep prisoners for weeks, if not months, sometimes 3-4 months when they're really unwell, floridly psychotic. So I think the services are stretched. Funding cuts have certainly not helped. I think the coronavirus is actually going to make everything even worse. So a lot of the courts have been shut or are not dealing with the more complex cases. So they're going to be flooded, I think, when the restrictions ease. And people in general are going to have more mental health issues. So I'm painting quite a bleak picture, I'm afraid, but that's how I see it.
And so, as regards this institutional racism, though, you've sort of answered what needs to change at recruitment level, more diversity.
Yes.
Is that change coming, or do you think it's still a long way off?
Ask me in 10 years.
Okay. Yeah.
I would like to sit here and say that I've seen indications that this change is coming, but I haven't, not in the time that I've worked in forensic psychiatry. I don't know what the aftermath of the coronavirus is going to be, but I think it's going to take possibly a couple of years just to get back to where we were before, just with the overload of new cases that are going to come in. So I think the fundamental problem of there not being enough money for mental health services full stop is the first thing that needs to be dealt with. And after that, we can look at the ethnic minority inequalities. So I think the system is so underfunded right now that it's creaking, and it's a breaking point.
Yeah. Is mental health perceived differently in different communities?
I think that's a very interesting question. So I think the answer is yes. So what we would classically see as some psychotic symptoms, so for example, hearing voices, in some communities it's conceptualized differently. So some communities see that as black magic. Some communities even see that as a positive experience, or like a spiritual experience. So what we would call a psychiatric patient is like almost a shaman who can hear the voice of God. And I think that if they're treated well within their societies, and if they manage to function, then obviously that's a good thing. But what concerns me is that it can delay or completely hinder paths to treatment. So we know research has clearly shown that if somebody suffers from a psychosis like schizophrenia, then the longer they're not treated, the longer they're not medicated, the worse their overall prognosis and outcome. So that's one sort of major aspect of it. And I suppose another one would be that in some communities, I mean, even in your mainstream Western community, there is a lot of stigma against mental illness, but I think it's even worse in some other communities. So it's kind of hidden. Right. And people just try to brush it under the carpet. And whereas occasionally that might work and it might go away, for serious mental illnesses, it almost never does.
Sohom, you're Asian. Your parents came from India, and you grew up in a village near Stockport, where yours, I understand, was the only Asian family.
That's correct.
Yeah,
I think one other Asian family moved in a couple of years after us.
Okay.
So we doubled overnight.
Right. So have you experienced racism in the UK?
Is it all right if I tell you a funny story related to this, and then I'll answer your question?
Yeah.
So I've got this cousin who is Asian, obviously, and he's got a white wife, and the two of them were being shown around houses around 7 years ago by a white estate agent, and my cousin was in a suit because he'd just come from work, and the owner of the house was there, and they grabbed his elbow and they took him into the room. And they were giving him instructions. They were just saying, you can show them from the outside, but please can you not actually go in because there's paint fumes. And my cousin was a bit confused, and he was like, I'm not the estate agent. But that's funny. We laugh about that. Yeah. He told me the story, and that's funny. But to answer your question, I grew up in a predominantly white area, and I think I was quite sensitive about being very different, and I had a big sense of not belonging. To be fair, when I reflect back on it, I don't think my experience was that bad, really. I had a few comments here and there. I was called Dr Sohom for a while, which I find quite amusing now, but it was quite upsetting at the time.
Yeah.
But luckily that didn't take off as a nickname. It phased out after a couple of weeks. I got on well with people. I had friends. I was quite sociable. So and my background and my values didn't feel very different from the people I was around. So I think I was quite lucky in life. So I grew up in Cheshire. I went to medical school in Edinburgh, which is quite a relaxed and a kind of studenty area. And then I've lived in London. I mean, I have got the odd comment, as I think everybody from a minority ethnic group has. But overall, I think I'm quite lucky. But I also think that I'm the anomaly. So lots of other friends and relatives have had much worse experiences. So my parents came over in 1962. And at that time, there was overt racism. So they had signs in shops saying no colours allowed. They would tell me of times where they would try and rent rooms, and they would be told over the phone that a room's available, and then they would go there 10 or 15 minutes later, and they'd be told that it's been taken, or sometimes they would have the door literally slammed in their faces. In terms of my more recent experiences, as I've gotten older, I've noticed what I think's not overt racism, and it's not something that comes from a place of hatred, but just a difference in the way that me and my family are treated. And we're kind of treated with more formality, and people are a bit standoffish in new social circumstances at times. So it's happened a few times, but one example that really stands out to me is I remember we went on holiday a couple of years ago into a ranch, and it was quite a small space, and there was several families that spent a lot of time together in a couple of weeks, and we all arrived on the same day. And I just remember everybody was friendly, but there was people were reserved in terms of coming up and introducing themselves to us and speaking to us. And we were the only non-white family there, and all the other families were within minutes just talking to each other, introducing themselves. And, we were all roughly the same age and had kids around the same age. And we did integrate, and to be fair, we actually got on very well by the end of the fortnight, and I made some friends from that holiday. But it felt like we had to put ourselves forward.
I was going to say, were you the ones making? Yeah, you had to really work at that, did you? Yeah.
It felt like we had to prove we're normal. We're not different from you. We can get on with you. I can talk to you about the same kind of things. I'm not offended by that. And I think that some people can be quite defensive about their perception of people being racist towards them, and that's not where I'm coming from. But yeah, it did feel like we really had to put the effort in.
Yeah, you're very gracious. You've said quite a few times it's not done with malice. You've just said that quite a few times, and about it being a subconscious thing. But then you've also said that you feel that you haven't had any really terrible experiences compared to what you've heard from others. So
absolutely. I'll tell you another interesting story, I think, is that I lived in Australia for about a year and a half. And in fact, that's where I started doing psychiatry as a career. So I went over as an A&E doctor, and then I changed halfway over there. And I was, again, quite lucky because a few of my friends from medical school went there before me. So I came over and I already had like a social group to slot myself into. And by the end of the time, I had lots of friends, and at least two, I think possibly three of the friends that we had out there who were Australian came up to me at different points, unprompted, without knowing that I had this conversation. And they just said to me directly, when we first saw you, it was quite confusing because we'd never had a conversation with an Asian person. Plus you've got this English accent, which was really confusing. And they just kind of assumed that I wouldn't sit with them and get drunk with them and, and have kind of chats and banters with them. And I think that you can't really be angry at somebody for making an assumption because they haven't experienced a kind of person before. I think they assume that I would have a different culture and different values and just wouldn't be able to click with them. But obviously the way to deal with that is you just be yourself and you just get on with people.
Yeah.
Getting on to sort of like what is happening, the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the protest, the taking down of statues and these things that people seem to have polarized views on. What's your take on it? Do you feel like there is a shift, that this is a movement rather than a moment?
I think there's a lot of anger, and I think it's justified. For me, it has to be done in the correct way, and there needs to be a correct outlet. So I'm all for peaceful protest, and I think it's really important, and especially if people or communities are feeling ignored, disadvantaged, disenfranchised. But I just think it's a shame that there is an opportunistic criminal element inside, which uses it as an opportunity to lash out from counter protesters as well, from the far right. And I think the problem with that, not only because violence is inherently wrong, but more importantly, it distracts from the actual issues. Because you see that some areas of the media, the right-wing press, and sometimes even the main-wing media focus on that. And I think that's very convenient because it helps us forget the real issues and the real questions that are being brought about by peaceful protesters. So that's one of my thoughts. I think it must be actually very frustrating for people who feel police brutality, especially because it's not changing. So if you consider that the Black Lives Matter movement started in 2013, I think it was, after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and now it's 7 years later, and black unarmed men are still being shot down by police. But having said all that, I'm speaking in quite a pessimistic way. I think that there does seem to be a bit of a shift. I think that people are starting conversations in lots of different areas. So not just policing, but music, entertainment, health, even education. So my wife is a teacher, and she was telling me that because of the Black Lives Matter movement and what's been going on in the States and over here, it's prompted them to have frank discussions about what they can do within their institution.
Brilliant.
And in general to combat racism and to support BAME staff and students more.
Thank you so much, Sohom, for talking to us and explaining some facts around issues relating to black communities, the criminal justice system and the mental health system, and generously giving us and our listeners the opportunity to get a bit more educated. Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
That's all for today, but do check the show notes for more information and ways to get in touch.
Produced by Louise Daniels. Visit louise-daniels.com.
Hiya, it's Rich Wilson, host of the excellent podcast Insane in the Membrane. I have a brand new podcast coming your way called Insane in the Fembrane, where I sit down with strong, confident, powerful women and find out what it takes to be a woman. Because I don't really know, to be honest. I thought I did, thought I had an idea, but I don't. So our first guest is star of Top Chef and soon to be on Netflix, Crazy Delicious. It's Carla Hall.
Prime example. I go out, I'm like, I'm gonna be a part of this yard thing. I'm gonna go out there. Okay, he cuts the grass, so I'm looking at those pine trees. It's like 9 of them. I'm looking at those pine trees. I'm like, they're taking over our yard. So I'm gonna go in and cut the base of the trees off, right? And just so it can be really pretty. But before I got to that, I said, I think I'm gonna cut the tips off. I had a rope. I said, Matthew, let's just go off and cut the tip off of one of those trees. They're too tall. He's like, I don't think that's gonna work. I said, you haven't tried. I go out with my rope. I didn't even get changed into a t-shirt. I have on a regular shirt because it's gonna be easy. I throw that rope up. I'm trying to lasso it to pull it down so we can just snip, snip. And I videotaped it. There was a video camera, and I wasn't even thinking about the video running. I went back to look at it. Matthew was standing there looking at me like, this ain't gonna work, but I'm gonna let you do it, honey. I'm gonna let you do it. And I am laughing at the video. It just captured this exact thing that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, I went out to step into his role. He's like looking at me like, that's not gonna work. That's not gonna work. You know? And I'm like, I had to see it for myself. It's like, you're right. But if he had said, Carla, it's not going to work, and just beat me down, I would have just pushed and pushed and pushed.
So that's episode 1 of Insane in the Fembrane. Go and listen, subscribe, tell your friends.